Hey, good morning, everyone. It's great to see you. Want to welcome our friends in Gallup as well today. Andy Reid is the head football coach for the Kansas City Chiefs. In case you didn't know that, they're now the three-time over the last 4 years or so Super Bowl champs. Just going to lay that out. But last summer, after they had won their second Super Bowl, and he had 2 Super Bowl rings. A reporter asked him which was his favorite ring. Of course, pointing to the fact that he now had 2 Super Bowl rings. But he quickly replied, "My wedding ring." Aw, right? That's so cool. I like that answer. Hey, we're going to talk about marriage today. And as we do talk about marriage, please understand that for a pastor like myself, preaching on marriage can be a kind of a touchy subject for a lot of people. And I think one of the reasons why marriage is such a touchy subject, and like when we hear sermons on that, is that there are so many emotions involved. Because we have so many things in our lives connected to how marriage has impacted us one way or another. And I'm going to throw this out. Maybe it's relevant in our culture today. The metro area with the top rate of divorced adults in the United States of America is Albuquerque. So maybe it's relevant. And again, that leads to the emotion of it all. Also, people come with different seasons, come in different seasons. Some of y'all maybe have been married, but are widowed or divorced, or maybe you just haven't been married yet, and you're not sure if this is in the cards. Also, there are some of y'all here today that marriage is good. Marriage is like one of the incredible joys of your life, and you're like, you know what? That love and respect thing, don't need that class because we're good, all right? And so we all understand that a little bit. Some of y'all are married today, and every day's a new day. Every day's a new challenge. Every day is a new battle. And maybe today the battle and winning the battle was just getting here this morning and you're still talking. And so that is one of the places where many people get. And there are some of y'all that might be married today, and you're just hoping you hear one thing today that will give you an excuse to get out. And I'll just say, if you hear that, you have heard me wrong. But I understand that we all come in different seasons. I think another challenge in talking about marriage in the church is that there are so many, what I'm going to call whatabouts. We talk about what about anger? We talked about that last week. And how does anger come into play in marriage? And how does a marriage survive when anger is, anger murders relationships, and marriage is a huge relationship, and it can negatively affect marriage. And there's also the what about abandonment or neglect or addiction or physical abuse? And I'm going to throw this out with physical abuse every time this comes up in conversation. If there's physical abuse and that is part of your marriage, our number one thing right now is be safe before we have any other conversations about helping rebuild and restore the marriage. But as we talk about marriage here today, please understand, I'm not here to beat anybody up. Really, we don't want to make you feel any worse than you already feel about yourself. Because I understand that sometimes in a marriage relationship, you can be married but still feel very, very alone. And so we're not here to make you feel bad. We're here really just to talk about marriage, have an honest conversation. As we have an honest conversation about marriage here today, please understand, I'm not going to say everything that can be said and maybe should be said about marriage. In fact, the reality is it's impossible to cover all of that in the limited time that we have here today. Some of you will maybe leave with more questions than you have answers. Again, those whatabouts that kind of come into play. Some of you will probably think that I have said too much, and some of you will come up to me afterwards and tell me what I should have said. But here's what I want to do. I want to look at Jesus' expectation for people who are citizens of his kingdom. And we're going to look specifically about what Jesus says about adultery and divorce and how that plays into marriage. We're also going to kind of piggyback on some of Jesus' dialogue that he had with religious teachers in Matthew chapter 19, and so on. So as we go through today, one ground rule before we hop into Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, it's going to be page 700 in the Bibles in the seats in front of you. If you don't have a Bible, go ahead and grab one of ours and put your name in it. Let it be yours. But as we go through marriage today, one thing I'm just going to ask is nobody gets to look at their spouse and go, nobody gets to nudge their spouse. That's the ground rule. So let's go ahead and dive in here today. We're going to start with verse 27. You have heard the commandment that says, you must not commit adultery. And so last week, Jesus started out with murder. You have heard the commandment that says that thou shalt not murder. And most everybody is probably looking, well, I'm not in prison, so I've either, one, gotten away with it, or two, I'm here. And the reason why I'm here is I've never committed murder. So you're able to check the box. And while maybe not as many people are going to be able to check the box on this one right here, most of the people in attendance that Jesus was talking to on that day were able to go, you know what, I'm good. They were able to check the box and say, I have never, ever cheated on my spouse. But this is where Jesus meddles, and this is where Jesus kind of turns the world upside down and really kind of introduces a new and radical standard in the marriage relationship. Let's look at verse 28. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so again, Jesus says, you've heard that was said, don't commit adultery. And everybody's like, yep, good. And then Jesus said, but I tell you, if you look at somebody with lust, you've already committed adultery. And then everybody's like, I'm toast. Because the reality is, lust is an issue. So let's talk about lust for a moment. One of the ways to really kind of identify what lust is to turn to a thing and keep your attention on that thing. Or it's looking and you keep on looking, and it's an object or of desire that is really off limits. It's forbidden. And so lust has always been a thing. Go back to the very first sin. Very, very first sin. It says the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and what? Pleasing to the eye. And I happen to believe that Adam and Eve were just kind of standing there looking. And looking. And they kept on looking. Knowing that they shouldn't look, but they just kept looking. Now, lust has always been a thing. It's still a thing. I'm going to even go as far as to say it is a driver of things. In fact, many people have said that you can look at technological advances in our culture, and the driver is lust. The driver is pornography. I'll even go back. Y'all remember the day and age where we had VHS tapes? Okay? We actually still have a few of those in our house, but we actually still have a VCR. I don't remember the last time we used it, but there was a day and age where it was the beta, right? Or the VHS. And the debate was which was better. Which won out? VHS. Do you know why VHS won out? Because it could actually have a longer playing time than the beta tapes. And that was largely driven by the pornography industry. Virtual reality headsets. different things that we see today oftentimes are driven by lust. In fact, I'm just going to tell you, my wife and I had a conversation just recently. Lust, or let me say it this way, pornography did not create lust. Lust created pornography. And that's one of the things that we find that is such a huge thing in our culture. And one of the challenges that we live with in our world today when it comes to the issue of lust and the sinfulness of that is there used to be a day and age, and many of you remember that day and age, where pornography was something you had to seek out. I remember when I was a kid, every boy knew whose dad had what magazines, right? And so you actually had to go seek it out. And today, it seeks you out. If you're on the internet, it is seeking you out. And in fact, it's becoming more and more brazen in that it is seeking people out. And so with that, it is a real thing. And the issue is, this has become in the church kind of one of those, in fact, my wife called it the silent secret sin. It's the sin that's there. It's the sin that people are dealing with. And one of the things that Satan loves to do with this sin is to bring an incredible amount of shame into this. And it's like you don't want anyone to know, because you are the only person in all the world that is dealing with this type of sin. But here's the reality, and this is as far back as the year 2000. Before the digital age fully exploded, Steve Otterburn wrote a book called Every Man's Battle. And Every Man's Battle is about lust and pornography and addiction and the sexual temptation and sin that kind of comes from all of this. So back in 2000, before the internet exploded, he was saying there's a reason why I'm calling this book Every Man's Battle. Because it's every man's battle. I'm just going to throw this out. I'm going to make a very broad statement. I'm going to put the odds at 100% with men. It's not an if you will deal with lust in your lifetime, but how and what degree. And so it's a real thing, and Jesus addresses this very real thing. And so I'm going to throw this out. There's a reason why there was a book called Every Man's Battle, because it is every man's battle. But I want to suggest it's not just a man's battle. Up to 20% of women, and I believe that number is probably higher, have confessed and acknowledged that they deal with a draw to pornography and the visual side of lust. So this is a human thing. And when we talk about this being a human thing, I just want to share this and put this out here. I think one of the reasons is God has created us as visual beings. Okay, we are drawn to beauty. Add to that, we are sexual beings. And the convergence of those two realities, if left unchecked, will lead us to sin. And not just lead us to sin like the physical sin, but Jesus even says, if it even happens in your mind, this is a reality. So we talk about lust, and that's a big thing. I want to talk about another component of such, and it's a term that we've kind of adapted. Now, there is a word called wanderlust. Do you know what wanderlust is? The desire to travel. Okay, so they will use that actual term. Many of you have wanderlust, right? Like, just take me to the beach, right? Okay, so there's that. But I want to talk about wanderlust, like W-O-N-D-E-R, wanderlust. Here's what happens inside of many relationships, and this is where we have to guard ourselves and so on, is the interactions you have with the opposite sex, who is not your spouse. It can be so easy. It can happen in a small group. It can happen in a friend group. It can happen at work, and you're having an interaction with a person of the opposite sex, and automatically you go, wow, they're more fun than my husband. They get me more than my husband. They get me more than my wife. We connect more than I do with my husband or wife. And that begins a dangerous path as well. And while it is not a visual sort of thing, it becomes a lust sort of thing where, again, you can't wait to talk to that person and you want to be around them. And that, again, leads to sin. And so Jesus, as the master teacher here, one of the things that I love is that he doesn't just present a problem, he presents a solution. And as we look at the solution here today, you're probably going to go, well, wait, what? So if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Now, is Jesus talking about self-mutilation here? Or is he making dramatic effect? I certainly hope he's making dramatic effect. I really think here's what Jesus is doing. He is saying take necessary steps to protect your mind, to guard your marriage. Take necessary steps to guard your mind to protect your marriage. So, or protect your mind to guard your marriage. Here is, I just want to throw out a couple of ideas before we move into marriage. Guard your mind from intrusive thoughts. I read this recently, heard this recently, and it kind of popped in my mind as like, wow, that's really good. Nearly every sin begins with an intrusive thought that is entertained too long. And I believe that's why in 2 Corinthians, Paul says we destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. We capture their rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ. So also, I'm going to throw out this, put up guardrails. Put up guardrails in your marriage. Put up boundaries. I say every couple, before they get married, should set up the boundaries that they have established for their marriage. Predetermine those boundaries. You remember Mike Pence? Mike Pence was vilified for saying that he would not have a closed-door meeting with a person of the opposite sex. That was a boundary. That was a guardrail. I'm going to say that if pornography is an issue, you need to have a thing called like Covenant Eyes on your device, on your computers. That's a little bit of a monitoring software. Nothing is fail-safe, but you can set up accountability. People get to see what you look at. And I think that's a good thing to have on your devices. One of the things that we have kind of set in our marriage, we have all those. I think we have about 3 million streaming services. Anybody with me? You have like Disney and YouTube, all the different. So those have parental locks on them. My wife is in our family the one with the parental locks. And so because we share with our kids and so on like that, we have things locked down, and we have things locked down for a purpose. So those are some of the guardrails. Another thing I'm just going to say here is find community. And if you don't have community, in fact, one of the things about community fosters the idea where you can confess and confide, and you can find accountability. And if you don't have that, I'm just going to throw this out. It's probably the easiest email address that we have in the Valley View system, jim@vv.church. He would love to talk with you, be able to get you in a group, get you in the context of relationship. So Jesus is done talking about really adultery, at least a little bit, and he gets into talking about marriage. And we find this in verses 31 and 32. He says, you have heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And this is like Jesus takes what was a pretty broad standard for divorce in their culture and really makes it very, very narrow and strict. In fact, if you go on to your Bibles in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus has dialogue about marriage. And it's interesting what happens in chapter 19, verse 3. It says some Pharisees, these are legal experts, some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question: should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? No fault divorce. And in Jesus' day, there were two thoughts on divorce. There was a rabbi named Hillel, and Hillel had the idea that if your wife became displeasing to you in any way, burned the toast, didn't keep house, on and on and on. If she became displeasing to you in any way, you could give her a written certificate of divorce and the marriage was over. In fact, it was actually legal for a man to say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you. Say it 3 times, it is legally binding, and you're out. Okay? So that was one of the schools of divorce. That was Hillel. Shammai, and these guys were good friends, trained by the same people, but Shammai would say, no, only for adultery is there grounds for divorce. And so basically the religious leaders of that day came to Jesus and said, what school are you in? What's your thought? And they actually wanted to trap him because there was another church leader or a religious leader who had spoke out against marital improprieties of Herod, and he lost his head. And so maybe Jesus speaks out, Herod gets ticked off, the Jesus problem goes away. But notice what Jesus says in verses 4 through 6. He says, haven't you read the scriptures? Jesus replied, they record that from the beginning, God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. And so instead of identifying with rabbinical thought, okay, Jesus says, my school's the Bible, and I go back to the creation account. And let me just say this. In every day, in every age, in every culture, the cultural concepts of marriage have always wanted a seat at the table to be able to say, well, we think marriage ought to be. Okay? That's always happened. It's always happened where, like, somebody says, well, I think marriage ought to be this or this, and so that's where we get no-fault divorce, and this is where we get polygamy, and this is where we get same-sex marriage, and this is where we get, just a few months ago, a news story where somebody married themselves. Okay? And so rather than entertaining the question, Jesus speaks to the permanency of marriage of one man and one woman for life. That this is the standard. This is what God set forth in the beginning. And so here's what we need to get, and I think what Jesus is getting at here: neither man nor government own marriage. Okay? The only entities at the table when it comes to determining what marriage is, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Nobody else gets a place to say, I think marriage ought to be. But I think Jesus is also saying, be very cautious. Be very cautious entering into the marriage relationship. And I think everybody, when they get married, kind of have that little bit of, oh no, what did I do? But sometimes people have a really big, oh no, what did I do? Because they were not cautious at all, didn't vet well in entering into this relationship. But in addition to this, I think Jesus is equally saying, but maybe even more emphatically saying, be very cautious exiting this relationship. Because ultimately, marriage isn't a disposable relationship. But here's the problem. When Jesus said this, it created more confusion than it did clarity. When Jesus said this about marriage, they were like, well, wait. We've got questions. In fact, notice verses 7 through 9 here. Then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away, they asked. And Jesus replied, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. And then again, and I tell you this: whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery, unless his wife has been unfaithful. So remember when I said at the beginning of the message that oftentimes one of the difficulties about preaching and teaching on marriage is that there's a lot of whatabouts. And this is one of the whatabouts. Well, what about Moses? What about in the law that it said that a man could give his wife a certificate of divorce and the divorce could be over? And it's interesting that as Jesus is talking about marriage, they're saying, well, what about Moses? And Jesus said, listen, God didn't give you this as a command. He gave you this as a concession. And he's conceding one reality that is going to be true in many marriages, and that is hard hearts. He gave you a concession because hearts are hard. Again, speaking to the condition of the heart, the heart is evil and wicked. And sometimes in marriage, that gets in the way. And I'll even go as far as to say, and I probably don't need to tell some of y'all, that in marriage, hardened hearts become a reality. Now, I can look at my own life, our own marriage, that there have been times that my heart has been incredibly hardened toward my wife. And I'll even go as far as to say that sometimes that becomes almost an impenetrable sort of heart. And that might be you right now, might have been you, might be your spouse right now, might have been your spouse. And when a hardened heart comes into the picture, it can be incredibly lonely. And you can be incredibly isolated. And last week, I mentioned something, and I'm just going to go ahead and throw this out again. Anger is a result of a hardened heart. Anger murders relationships. And sometimes that anger, let's just be honest, sometimes we treat our spouse worse than we treat the stranger at Walmart that we say hi to once or twice. And so it's a reality. But after speaking on hardened hearts again, I want to go back to verse 19, and this echoes chapter 5, verse 32. And I tell you that whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery. And unless his wife has been unfaithful. And listen, I know that there are many folks in this room here today that have walked through divorce. And the Bible, in the book of Malachi, it says God hates divorce. And I want to just share with you, I believe God hates what divorce does to people. And so it's tough. And I had a friend tell me one time who had walked through a divorce. He said, it would have been easier if she just would have died. Death would have been easier than divorce. It's a tough thing. And in each instance that Jesus talks about marriage, both in Matthew 5, or divorce, Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, Jesus cracks the door open for the possibility of divorce. Now please understand, it's not a mandate, it's not a suggestion, it's not a command, it is a possibility. And I think we do need to be very clear that the physical act of adultery breaks the marriage covenant. That's biblical truth. And so with that, some have suggested that what Jesus is talking about here is called the exception clause. You know, divorce is wrong except in this case right here. But I want to be very clear. If Jesus is putting forth an exception clause, this must never be viewed as an escape clause. I'm going to go as far as to tell you this. I know of, I would say probably dozens of marriages that I've worked with through the years that have weathered the storm of physical adultery. And I would even say weathered the storm, got through the storm, and I look at their marriage today and I admire them and I respect them, and in many cases look at that marriage and say, wow, those are relationship goals right there. So it doesn't have to be the end. This doesn't have to be the end of the story. But I have also seen situations where there has been rampant, unrepentant, habitual adultery, and one spouse finally just says, I'm done. They just are incapable in their humanness to continue to walk in that relationship. And so when Jesus is done here, he mentions the idea that this is not as clean cut as we want to make it today. And I don't have a lot of time to get into this because I want to get into some practical steps here in a moment. But I think Jesus, again, speaks to the permanency of marriage against the sin of incompatibility that many people were just using in that day and age and use today to say, well, we're incompatible. It's just not working out. I'm going to get out and marry somebody else. And he's like, it's not that easy. And he even suggests the possibility of remaining single. In fact, I've actually told a person or two through the years, maybe God wants you to be single. I've even told a few people through the years, I don't think you're very good at marriage. Seriously. But Jesus actually lays out that singlehood is a perfectly good, viable option for many people. And so with that, I know I've thrown a lot out at you today, but I want to give you a bottom line here today. And again, we're going to continue what Jesus expects of citizens of his kingdom. Jesus expects citizens of his kingdom to fight for, value, honor, and prioritize marriage. And when I say fight for, I want to share something with you. I know exactly where my wife was standing having a conversation with a lady in our church many years ago whose husband had cheated. And Tara looked at her and said, "Are you done?" She said, "No, I'm not. I don't want to divorce him." And Tara said, "Fight for your marriage." And she looked at Tara and said, "Out of everyone I've talked to about the journey that we're going through right now, you're the only one who has encouraged me to fight for my marriage." Folks, we got to fight for this. This is something that God has called us to do. So I want to lay out, if you're a note taker, there's a lot of notes to take even still after the bottom line here today. I want to lay out some items that I think are incredibly important as we look at marriage in the church. And one, as we strive for a radical, upside-down kingdom standard that Jesus lays out in marriage, let us also fight for an equally radical and upside-down grace to people. Here's the reality. Jesus, I heard this on the news this week, and I wanted to fight against it until I thought about this. Two things can be true at the same time. We can fight for an incredible standard in marriage, but we can also fight for grace when people don't live up to that standard. I mean, Jesus in John 4 was at a well with a lady who was ostracized by a sinful community. And Jesus, in the middle of the conversation, said, you know what? Go get your husband. She goes, I'm not married. He goes, you're right. You had 5 husbands. And the person that you're with right now is not your husband. Yet Jesus engaged her and spoke with her and revealed himself to her. In John chapter 8, a woman was caught in adultery, and that was the infamous line, he who is without sin, cast the first stone. Now, again, what did Jesus say? Do they condemn you? He said, no. He said, neither do I. But again, it had an incredible standard. Also, unpack your bags. When things get rough in your marriage, don't buy into that you've married the wrong person. Unpack your bags and fight for your marriage. I'll even add to that, work your own vineyard. Song of Solomon, great book. It gives us many pictures into the marriage relationship, and it's all poetry, and it's kind of hard to understand, especially a simple mind like mine. But I love when they talk about working the vineyard, tending the vineyard. And again, I love the imagery. This is not a field that you plow and you just put in the hard work, but there's finesse and there's effort and there's time and there's energy. Tend your vineyard. It even talks about having a tower in the vineyard. That's for protection. Protect the vineyard. Protect your marriage. Embrace mutuality. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul, the apostle, teaches on marriage. And he says something very important, that in marriage you need to see that your body is not your own. That you need to treat the body of your spouse in the very same way that you would treat your own body. And beyond the intimacy factor, this is a standard of truly living for one another. So a little bit of brutal honesty here. I'm just going to throw this out. My wife and I both look at times in our marriage where we're surprised that we made it through. Really are. I don't know when it happened. I don't know how it happened. But there's a culture within our marriage right now that there is mutuality. And, we've been married 31 years, and I truly believe it's just getting better and better. And part of that is mutuality. Also, I'm just going to throw this out. Seek help. We're starting Love and Respect tonight. That's one component. You can have an opportunity to dive into marriage in a real way. Begin a different conversation. Flip the script of what's happening in your relationship. Also, our marriage ministry is willing to meet with couples one-on-one. And so if that's something that you are seeking and needing, I'm just going to make things very clear. I'm going to again say jim@vv.church, and he will get you to the right people to do that. And it's not that I don't want to deal with this. It's just that he's our spiritual formation guy. Also this. Embrace that God is not done. Listen. Where you are doesn't have to be the end of the story. In fact, I would invite you to read Matthew chapter 1, which is the genealogy of Jesus. There are a lot of scumbags and crooks in that genealogy. And there's stories of divorce and some really wonky sort of stories with some really bad sort of people. And God took less than ideal circumstances and brought about his glory and plan. And he can take the less than ideal circumstances in your marriage and do the exact same. Let's pray. God and Father, thank you. Thank you for marriage. May we fight. Thank you in Jesus' name.